Our scripture comes from the second chapter of Matthew. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in the territory of Judea during the rule of King Herod, Magi came from the east to Jerusalem. They asked, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We've seen his star in the east and we've come to honor him." When King Herod heard this, he was troubled, and everyone in Jerusalem was troubled with him. He gathered all the chief priests and the legal experts, and he asked them where the Christ was to be born. And they said, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what the prophet wrote. You, Bethlehem, land of Judah, by no means are you least among the rulers of Judah, because from you will come one who governs, who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the Magi and found out from them the time when the star had first appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search carefully for the child, and when you found him, report to me, so that I too may go and honor him." When they heard the king, they went, and the star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stood over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They entered the house. They saw the child with Mary, his mother. Falling to their knees, they honored him. When they opened their treasure chests, they presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And because they were warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they went back to their own country by another route. And it is the last line of this story of the Magi visiting Jesus that always sticks with me. They went back to their home country by another route, or the way that I learned it, they went home by another way. That one thing, that one small part of the story is so key to our story, that these men were able to decide that it was time to make a change in plans is crucial to everything that happens next. So to really wrap our heads and our hearts around the story, we need to step back and get a better understanding of who these men were and why their presence even mattered. Now let's be clear. Our songs, our Christmas cards, even our children's Christmas plays may have given us a not quite accurate picture of the Magi. We don't really know how many there were. We talk about three kings, we sing about three kings, and we usually put three well-dressed gentlemen into our major scenes carrying expensive gifts. But Scripture doesn't actually tell us how many Magi made the trip from the east into Jerusalem and then on to Bethlehem. And so we say three because three different gifts are named. And they weren't kings. They were most likely Zoroastrian priests, scholars of the day, and members of one of the oldest religions in the world, a religion that is still active in Iran today. They were known for telling fortunes and astrology, and they had access to the emperor of Persia. They were people of influence, absolutely, but they were not kings, and probably important for us to notice at least is they are not part of our faith ancestry. These were religious men from a completely different line of belief, and they played an important role in our story. We owe something to these men and their way of finding and living out their faith. Something to ponder as well. When the Magi went looking for this newborn king, they went to Jerusalem instead of Rome, which is where most of the world at the time would have expected a new king to be born. And so very early in the story, we encounter some people who are willing to look at things from a very different point of view. Matthew's scripture tells us that when the Magi arrived in Jerusalem and began asking questions about the newborn king, Herod and all of Jerusalem was troubled. Something new was happening. Something strange was happening. And so, what about you? How do you feel when there's something new afoot? When there are disturbances in the way things have always been? I mean, I think most of us at least get a little nervous because we want to know what's happening, and we want to know why it's happening, and we want to know when everything is going to happen. We think about all the good and comfortable conditions that we have created for ourselves, and we don't really want anything to come along and change that. And it might seem odd that the appearance of these Eastern mystics could cause Herod and all of Jerusalem to be disturbed, but then think of what Herod had created for himself there in Jerusalem. He had a comfortable kingdom that worked out well for him and his friends, or at least the people who acted as if they were his friends. He had a certain amount of authority. He had homeland rule granted to him from Rome. He was under Rome's control, but he had pretty sizable leeway in his decision making. And so as long as things stayed manageable and comfortable for Herod, the people of Jerusalem, and for Rome, well, there was really no need to make any big changes. Now, Herod might have actually had enough power and enough confidence to decide that if another king was actually on the rise, that when the time came, he would need to simply stand against him, squash him, defeat him. But in listening to his priests and his legal experts tell him about the prophecies around this child king, Herod may have come to realize that there was something more at stake here than just political power. Because it would seem that this new king would also be a very different sort of king, a king who would shepherd the people of Israel. You see, since the time of King David, Israel had been told that the right image of a king was the same as the image of a shepherd. David was called from the work of being a shepherd into the work of being a king. And while we know that David didn't always meet the expectation of a good and nurturing king, that was the image that God had offered of what a king really should be. Someone who took responsibility of keeping a flock safe and guiding them to places where they most needed to be. And Herod was not a shepherd king. His ethics did not reflect that of one who took seriously the task of taking care of others. He was a man of ruthless power, a man of political gamesmanship, and a man who believed that if he was going to stay in power, then he needed to play hard and not show any mercy to anyone who could get in his way. And so he pulled those magi aside and he told them to follow that star on to Bethlehem, but to also come back to him and tell him exactly where he could find the child king when he was ready to pay him a visit. On to Bethlehem they went. These men with no connection to the Jewish people, no belief in their prophets, no hope for a Messiah, and yet able to realize that they needed to do something and to do something differently. They needed to follow the star wherever it took them. They needed to stop and check in with the people of Jerusalem to learn what they could tell them. They needed to pay their respects to Herod and soak up the directions that he might give them. And then finally, when they arrived in Bethlehem, they needed to honor the child and give him the kind of gifts that they would bring to any king. They brought him gold, a sign of royalty, frankincense, which represented wisdom, and myrrh, which was a sign of long life and healing. Expensive, fitting gifts for one who would be known as a king, expensive, surprising gifts for a child of poor parents living in the unremarkable town of Bethlehem. And when their visit was finished, the Magi paid attention to what they had been told now in a dream, and they agreed among themselves that they would not return to Jerusalem to report on the whereabouts of the child Jesus. Instead, they decided to make a drastic change in their plans and go home by another way. As we read on into the story, we learn that Joseph also had an important dream, one that told him to take the child Jesus and his mother Mary and run. Run to another country, run and hide out there until it was safe for them to come back home. This part of Jesus' story is full of events that Jesus did not control, that Jesus was far too young to have any say. And yet they are events that shape so much of what was yet to come. The people around Jesus were making decisions, life-changing decisions that would become world-changing decisions, and none of the choices were easy, and all of them carried consequences. And so we like to take our story of the Magi and lock it down into a neat little package to see them only as kings who came to honor the Christ child. But when we do that, we miss so much of what shapes our story and what can shape our faith and our lives. And that is the opportunity that we all have to make decisions that can also bring about change. Now, the changes in this story are of welcoming people who are very different from you into your home, stories of recognizing that our choices in life have consequences, and while it may not be convenient and it may require us to be uncomfortable and perhaps even a little afraid, sometimes we have to take a brand new path through life. And they are stories that remind us that even when we make the best choices possible, we can't always control the outcome. You see, if we're willing to read on in this story, we learn that because Jesus was kept safe and because the Magi went home another way, Herod's anger was so over the top that he called for the massacre of all children under a certain age. He was so convinced that he had to stop the rise of this new king and a new kind of king that he was willing to sacrifice an untold number of innocent lives in order to do so. And I really don't know what to make of that part of the story. It is an awful, horrible part of our story. It's one that's hard to read and harder still to understand, but there it is. A reminder that evil exists and that evil intentions sometimes win out, and that power that is not given a counterbalance can lead to some pretty horrible decisions. For us today, the question can simply be, what is it that we are called to change in our own lives? And what ways are we living that threaten to harm others or even ourselves? What paths are we following that are leading us into more darkness instead of light? In the church calendar, this day is called Epiphany. It means a revealing, taking the cover off something wonderful so that everybody can see it. Epiphany opens up a season in the church in which we turn from talking about the coming birth of Jesus and to those light-giving stories from his life. And so all of our talk about a star and angel choruses provide images of Jesus as light coming into a world that walked in darkness. And we may have a hard time really grasping that idea. It could be that we lead lives that are already full of light and joy, family, career, success. But for many, life is marked by grief or loss or broken dreams, failure, even shame. And for most of us, let's be honest, it's a mixture of the two. Places of joy, places of hardship. All of us, I think, long for light that comes from the hope of Jesus. And so this wonderful story of the Magi and then the shadow of the terrible story that follows it is a reminder to us that the world into which Jesus was born was full of darkness. People lived under the thumb of Herod and others like him, and they knew that to rise up against him could mean something even worse for themselves and for their families. And while they could not hope for anything better from Herod or from Rome, what they could do was hope for the light of God, the light that God had one day promised would come into the darkness. And the Magi, they could have taken the easy way home. They could have just retraced their steps. They could have let Herod bring an end to the story that we live and believe today, but they didn't. We don't know how they felt about their choice, but we can imagine, like all of us, they found change to be at least a little bit terrifying, that there was at least a little conversation among them on this is what we should do, or maybe we should just go back the way we came, or what are we supposed to do next? So what are we to do with this day of Epiphany? This day of continuing the work of getting ready to make changes. What should we do with this day of getting ready to make the changes that we want to make in our lives, or maybe we feel nudged to make in our lives or in our faith, or maybe somebody is telling us, maybe even nagging at us that we need to make? What if we use today and the story of Jesus and the Magi to just begin to push at some of the fears that may be holding us captive and that are keeping us from living a light-filled life? What if we agreed that change is hard and often scary? What if we agreed that change, even small change, requires a certain amount of courage? And what if we agreed that our faith is a faith that tells us, do not be afraid? What if we could see that our faith is a faith that offers us choices between what is new and unknown and what is old and familiar, and that we get to choose which one of those paths we need to follow in this particular moment? What if we could agree that we can embrace a faith that gives us what we need to follow another path when that is the right choice, and to be able to go home by another way? And what if we agreed that as we think about those changes that are working their way through our minds and our spirits now, that we can begin to also understand that God created us with minds that can be changed and hearts that can be made new, and spirits that can find courage to move forward in life. So today, traditionally, is the close of the Christmas season, and I find it a little weird that we've made Epiphany the day to put away all the decorations and turn off the lights on the tree and around the house. So while it may bother the neighbors and it may even bother your sense of how things are supposed to be done, if you haven't already done so, maybe give yourself permission to leave the lights up for just a little longer, or find a light to put up somewhere, one that says Epiphany to you, revealing new light, opportunities, new paths. This is a day to celebrate that a light has come that will never go out, a light of faith, a light of hope, a light of joy that shines in the darkness, a light of peace that we can find within ourselves and others. And so may the light guide us through whatever comes next and whatever decisions we are making in these days that await us.